Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest changes in our lives. When everyone else sees worthless animals, one man sees souls that need care. Clyde Renner has spent 63 years watching his ranch slowly crumble under debt and drought in New Mexico. At a livestock auction, 2 beaten donkeys are brought out to jeers and laughter. Most see trouble, but when Clyde steps forward with his last dollars and whispers, "I'll give you a home," something begins to change, not just for the animals, but for a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed. What starts as compassion becomes a journey that transforms Clyde, his companions, and their community. But can 3 broken souls heal each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Sangre de Cristo mountains in shades of copper and gold. But Clyde Renner barely noticed anymore. He stood at his kitchen window, weathered hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that had seen better decades, watching his cattle move slowly across what used to be prime grazing land. The grass grew sparse now, patchy and yellow where it grew at all. 3 years of drought had turned his family's legacy into something that looked more like a moonscape than the thriving ranch his grandfather had carved from this high desert country. Clyde was 63, though the sun and wind had etched lines into his face that made him look older. His hands told the story of a life spent working, thick calluses, permanent dirt under the nails and scars from barbed wire, tools, and the 1,000 small accidents that come with raising cattle in unforgiving country. His hair, once dark brown like his father's, had gone silver white, and he kept it short and practical under the worn Stetson that rarely left his head. The kitchen where he stood hadn't changed much since his wife Margaret passed 7 years ago. Her coffee cup still sat in the cabinet, her recipe card still filled the wooden box beside the stove, and her curtains still hung at the windows, faded now but somehow comforting. He'd thought about updating things, maybe getting one of those modern coffee makers instead of the old percolator. But change felt like betrayal. Some mornings, he could almost hear her humming while she cooked breakfast. Almost smell her perfume mixing with the bacon grease and coffee. Walking to the roll-out desk in the corner, Clyde pulled out a manila folder thick with papers, bills, mostly, and letters from the bank that grew more urgent each month. But underneath the modern correspondence lay something different, a hand-drawn map on yellowed paper, the edges soft with age and handling. His father's map. Robert Renner had drawn it in 1962 when he first bought this land, sketching every fence line, water source, and pasture with the careful precision of a man who understood that knowing your land meant survival. The map showed property lines that stretched over 800 acres, marked with his father's careful handwriting. North pasture, good for winter grazing. Spring here never runs dry, protected. Best soil for hay, Margaret's garden spot. That last notation had been added later, after Clyde brought his young wife home and she'd insisted on a vegetable garden near the house. Clyde traced the fence lines with his finger, remembering when every inch of this property had been productive. His father had raised good cattle here, enough to send Clyde to college and still put money in the bank. The land had supported 3 generations of Renners, and Clyde had always assumed it would support the 4th and 5th. But life had other plans. The trouble started small, the way these things usually do. A few dry summers that stressed the grass. Cattle prices that didn't quite cover expenses. Equipment that needed repairs they couldn't afford to delay. Then Margaret got sick and the medical bills started piling up like autumn leaves. Even after she passed, the debt remained. Growing interest, like some malignant thing that fed on his grief and his dwindling hope. Now he was down to 43 head of cattle from the 120 he'd run in better years. The north pasture sat empty. He'd sold that section's cattle last spring to make the mortgage payment. The tractor was older than some of his neighbors' children, held together with wire and determination and prayer. Some mornings it started on the first try, and Clyde took those as good omens. Other mornings, he'd have to coax it to life with the patience of a man who understood that everything mechanical like everything else, needed a little kindness to keep going. He folded the map carefully and returned it to the folder. Outside, his border collie, Sam, was already waiting by the porch steps. Sam was getting old too. His black coat shot through with grey, but he still knew the routine. Morning chores, then breakfast, then the long day's work of keeping a dying ranch alive. The barn held memories in every corner. His grandfather's old saddles hung on pegs that Robert Renner had installed with his own hands. Tools that had served 3 generations lined the walls, some still useful, others kept more for sentiment than function. Margaret's horse, a gentle mare named Stella, had lived out her last years in the 3rd stall. Clyde had buried her under the cottonwood tree beside the creek, next to the graves of the other animals that had been part of the family. Feeding time was a simple ritual now. The cattle knew his truck, knew the sound of hay bales being dragged from the bed. They'd gather at the fence, patient in the way that cattle are, waiting for him to cut the wire and spread the hay. He talked to them as he worked, commenting on the weather, on how the grass was looking, on whether it might rain. They listened with the polite attention of creatures who understand that humans need to fill silence with words. "Morning, ladies," he said to the small herd. "I know it's not much, but it's what we've got." The hay was expensive now, trucked in from Colorado, where they'd had better luck with rain. Every bale represented money he didn't have, but cattle had to eat. That was the fundamental equation of ranching. Sometimes you fed the animals before you fed yourself. Back at the house, Clyde made eggs and bacon, the same breakfast he'd eaten for 40 years. He ate at the kitchen table, looking out at his land and thinking about the auction advertisement he'd seen in the local paper. The Hendersons were selling out, moving to town, where Bill could work at the feed store and Linda could be closer to her sister. It was a story being repeated all across rural New Mexico. Small ranches closing, families leaving land that had been home for generations, young people heading to the cities where jobs paid better and life was easier. The auction was set for Saturday. Clyde hadn't planned to go. He had no money for equipment and no need for more cattle. But something about the advertisement had caught his attention. Complete dispersal, it read. Everything must go. There was something final about those words. Something that spoke to endings and the way things pass from one hand to another. After breakfast, he walked the fence line, checking for breaks and loose wire. This was work that never ended on a ranch. Cattle were escape artists, always looking for the weak spot that would let them into greener pastures. The wire was old, much of it put up by his father's hands, but it still held. Like everything else on the place, it endured because it had to. The day warmed as the sun climbed higher, and by afternoon the temperature reached into the 80s. Clyde worked in the shade when he could, remembering what his father had taught him about pacing himself in the heat. "A man can work all day in any weather," Robert used to say, "as long as he's got sense enough to listen to his body." Evening came with the golden light that made even struggling land look beautiful. Clyde sat on the porch, Sam at his feet, watching the cattle settle for the night. The mountains caught the last light and held it, purple and rose, against the darkening sky. Margaret used to sit beside him in the evenings, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching the land they loved change colors with the setting sun. The silence was complete out here, broken only by the occasional lowing of cattle or the sound of wind through the sparse grass. No traffic, no sirens, no human noise except what he made himself. It was the kind of quiet that city people found unsettling, but to Clyde it was as necessary as breathing. He'd tried living in town briefly after Margaret died, renting a small apartment near the hospital where she'd spent her last months. The noise had nearly driven him mad. Televisions and radios and cars and voices at all hours. He'd lasted 2 weeks before coming home to the ranch and the healing quiet of open country. Inside, he heated leftover stew for dinner and ate while listening to the weather report on the radio. No rain in the forecast for the next 10 days. The drought would continue, and the grass would get a little more sparse, and the cattle would need more expensive hay. The cycle would continue until something broke, either the weather or his resolve or his bank account. Before bed, he pulled out the folder again and looked at his father's map one more time. All those careful notations, all that hope and planning and faith in the future. Robert Renner had drawn this map, believing that the land would provide, that hard work and good stewardship would be enough. For 50 years, he'd been right. For the last 10, Clyde was learning that sometimes even the best-tended dreams could wither like grass in a drought. But tomorrow, he'd get up and feed the cattle and check the fence and do all the things that ranchers do. Because that's what Renners did. They endured. They held on. They kept faith with the land and the animals and the memories of everyone who'd worked this ground before them. And maybe, just maybe, something would change. Maybe the rains would come, or the cattle prices would improve, or some small miracle would present itself. In the meantime, he had work to do. Saturday morning arrived cool and clear, the kind of day that promised heat later, but started with gentle breezes and comfortable temperatures. Clyde found himself dressing more carefully than usual. Clean jeans instead of work clothes, a shirt Margaret had bought him that he rarely wore, his good boots instead of the scuffed ones he used for chores. He told himself he was just going to observe, maybe visit with neighbors he hadn't seen in a while, but something deeper was at work. Some instinct he couldn't name had been pulling at him since he'd seen the auction advertisement. The Henderson place was 20 miles south, down a dirt road that wound through country similar to his own. As he drove, Clyde could see the signs of the same struggles that plagued his ranch: overgrazed pastures, empty corrals, equipment lots with more rust than paint. But there were also signs of life continuing, of families making do, of the stubborn persistence that kept rural communities alive against all odds. Cars and trucks lined the road near the Henderson ranch. More vehicles than Clyde had seen in one place for months. Neighbors, dealers, and curiosity seekers had come from 3 counties to pick over the remnants of a family's life work. Auctioneers called these events dispersals, but Clyde had always thought dissolution was more accurate. When a ranch went under, it dissolved like salt in water, all the years of work and hope and struggle spreading out into other hands. Other stories. He parked his truck in a field designated for overflow parking and walked toward the main auction area, where a portable stage had been set up near the barn. Folding chairs arranged in rows were already filling with bidders, some serious-looking men with notebooks and calculators, others clearly there for the entertainment value. Farm auctions were social events in rural communities, places where people caught up on gossip and sized up their neighbors' financial situations. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice that carried like a trained singer's, was warming up the crowd with jokes and commentary while his assistants organized the first lots. Cattle went first. The Hendersons had managed to keep a decent herd despite their troubles, and the bidding was spirited. Clyde watched the numbers climb and did quick calculations in his head. Even in a forced sale, these cattle were bringing more per head than he could afford. Next came the machinery, and here the real drama unfolded. Tractors and implements that represented decades of investment were knocked down for fractions of their replacement cost. A hay baler that had cost $40,000 new sold for $8,000 to a dealer from Amarillo. A disc harrow that Bill Henderson had bought just 3 years earlier brought barely enough to cover the remaining loan payment. Clyde spotted several familiar faces in the crowd. Jim Morrison from the next valley over, bidding on a hay rake. The Petersons, an elderly couple who seemed to be there more for the social aspect than any serious buying. Young Danny Castillo, recently returned from the military and trying to start his own operation, taking notes and watching everything with the intensity of someone who couldn't afford to make mistakes. The bidding moved efficiently through livestock and machinery, and Clyde was beginning to think about leaving when the auctioneer's voice took on a different tone. "All right, folks, we've got a couple of items here that I'll be honest with you about. 2 donkeys, both in need of some care. Now, I know most of you are here for cattle and equipment, but maybe somebody's got a use for these fellas." 2 men led a pair of donkeys into the small corral beside the auction stage, and the mood in the crowd shifted immediately. Laughter rippled through the seats. Not kind laughter, but the harsh sound people make when they encounter something they consider ridiculous. The donkeys were in terrible shape, thin to the point of showing ribs, their coats dull and patchy, their heads hanging low with exhaustion or resignation. Now these here belonged to some folks who couldn't properly care for them, the auctioneer continued, his professional cheerfulness unable to disguise the distaste in his voice. The county animal control seized them about 3 weeks ago, and they're looking for someone to take them off their hands. I'll start the bidding at $50 for the pair. The laughter grew louder. Someone called out, "Are you paying us $50 to haul them away?" Another voice added, "Those things ain't worth the cost of the bullet to put them down." Clyde felt something tighten in his chest. The smaller of the two donkeys, a female with a grey coat that might have been beautiful when she was healthy, lifted her head at the sound of human voices. Her eyes held an expression he recognized, the patient endurance of a creature that had learned not to expect kindness, but hadn't yet stopped hoping for it. "Come on now," the auctioneer pressed. "Somebody's got to have a use for these animals. $25 for the pair. That's $12.50 each, folks." More laughter, more cruel comments. The larger donkey, darker brown with white markings around his muzzle, stood protectively close to his companion. They leaned into each other, drawing comfort from proximity in a hostile world. Something about that gesture, the simple, wordless support one broken creature offered another, hit Clyde harder than the sight of their physical condition. $20 then. Surely someone can go $20. The crowd was losing interest, conversations starting up as people discussed more serious lots coming later. The donkeys would likely go unsold, returned to whatever temporary shelter was housing them, their fate uncertain. Clyde found himself standing without conscious decision, his hand reaching for the numbered paddle he'd been given when he registered. "I'll give you 25, he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the relative quiet. Heads turned toward him, some neighbors nodding recognition, others looking puzzled. The auctioneer seemed genuinely surprised, but recovered quickly. "Thank you, sir. I've got $25. Do I hear 30? The crowd had gone quiet, watching this unexpected development. Clyde looked at the donkeys again, saw the way they stood together, saw the defeat in their posture and the lingering spark of life in their eyes. $25. That was a week's worth of groceries or gas for his truck, or any number of necessities he could barely afford. "Going once at $25, the auctioneer announced. Someone in the back of the crowd called out, "Better check if your insurance covers stupidity, Clyde." More laughter, but Clyde barely heard it. He was thinking about his father's map, about the notations in careful handwriting, about the faith that had built this ranch, and the love that had sustained it. He was thinking about Margaret's garden and the way she'd always found room for one more flower, one more vegetable, one more growing thing that needed tending. Going twice. The female donkey looked directly at him, and for a moment their eyes met across the dusty corral. In that gaze, he saw something he hadn't expected, intelligence, dignity, and a question that might have been hope. "Sold for $25 to bidder number 47. The crowd applauded politely and immediately began discussing the next lot, but Clyde barely noticed. He was walking toward the corral, his legs carrying him forward, while his mind tried to catch up with what he'd just done. $25 for two animals he had no use for, no facility to properly house, and no money to feed. But as he approached the fence and the donkeys lifted their heads to watch him, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. The satisfaction of having done something right. The transaction was simple. He paid cash and arranged to borrow a neighbor's trailer to transport the donkeys. Jim Morrison offered to help load them, and together they coaxed the animals up the ramp with patience and gentle pressure. The donkeys went willingly enough, as if they understood that any change might be an improvement. "You sure about this, Clyde?" Jim asked as they secured the trailer gate. Clyde looked at his new charges through the trailer slats. They stood close together, the larger one's head protectively over the smaller one's neck. "No," he said honestly, "but I guess we'll figure it out together." The drive home was slow and careful, Clyde checking his mirrors constantly to make sure his passengers were handling the journey. When he pulled into his own driveway, the donkeys were still standing, still leaning into each other for support. He parked near the barn and sat for a moment, engine off, listening to the quiet sounds the animals made, not the distressed braying he might have expected, but soft nickering noises that sounded almost conversational. As he opened the trailer, both donkeys looked at him with what seemed like cautious curiosity. The female stepped out first, her hooves careful on the unfamiliar ground. The male followed, and together they looked around at their new surroundings, the barn, the corrals, the endless view of high desert country stretching toward the mountains. "Well," Clyde said, his voice gentle in the evening air, "I guess this is home now." The donkeys stood quietly beside the trailer, waiting for food, for direction, for some indication of what would happen next. Clyde realized he didn't have ready answers to any of those questions. He had two animals he knew nothing about, resources stretched to the breaking point, and a growing certainty that he'd just made either the best decision or the worst mistake of his life. But as the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the three of them stood together in the quiet of the ranch. And Clyde felt something he'd almost forgotten, the weight of being needed, the responsibility of caring for something beyond himself. It was terrifying and comforting in equal measure, like all the most important moments in life. The next morning brought the reality of his decision into sharp focus. Clyde woke before dawn, as he had every day for 40 years, but instead of his usual routine, he found himself walking to the corral where he'd penned the donkeys for the night. They were awake, standing close together near the fence, watching his approach with alert ears and cautious eyes. In the growing light, their condition looked even worse than it had at the auction. The female's ribs showed clearly through her dull grey coat, and both animals had patches where the hair had been rubbed away, leaving raw spots that looked painful. Their hooves were overgrown and cracked, and when Clyde offered them hay, they ate with the desperate urgency of creatures who'd learned not to count on regular meals. "Easy there, girl," he murmured to the smaller donkey as she pushed past her companion to reach the feed. "There's enough for both of you." The male was more cautious, keeping one eye on Clyde even as he ate. His dark coat was patchy with malnutrition, but underneath the neglect, Clyde could see the potential for a handsome animal. The way he positioned himself between Clyde and the female spoke of protective instincts and intelligence. After watching them eat, Clyde went inside and found the phone book. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been the area's large animal veterinarian for 15 years, and she knew every ranch and every animal for 50 miles around. She also knew which ranchers paid their bills on time and which ones struggled to pay at all. "Elena, it's Clyde Renner. I need you to come take a look at a couple of animals when you get a chance." "Clyde," her voice carried genuine warmth. "How are you doing out there? What kind of animals are we talking about?" "Well, I bought a pair of donkeys at the Henderson auction yesterday, and they're in pretty rough shape. I need to know what I'm dealing with." There was a pause on the line. "Donkeys? Clyde, you don't strike me as the donkey type. That makes two of us. But here we are. I can be there this afternoon if that works. Fair warning, house calls cost more than they used to, with gas prices what they are." Clyde closed his eyes and thought about his checking account balance. "I know, we'll make it work." The hours until Dr. Vasquez arrived dragged by. Clyde found himself checking on the donkeys every hour, offering water, trying to assess their condition with his inexperienced eyes. The female seemed more trusting, allowing him to approach within a few feet before moving away. The male maintained his distance, protective but not aggressive. By noon, Clyde had decided on names. The female, with her grey coat and surprisingly delicate features, reminded him of his great-aunt Belle, a woman who'd maintained her dignity through difficult times. The male, solid and protective despite his poor condition, would be Buck, strong, dependable, the kind of name for an animal you could count on. Dr. Vasquez arrived in a truck that had seen as much rough country as Clyde's own. She was a compact woman in her 40s, with graying black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. She delivered calves in blizzards, treated horses with colic at 3 in the morning, and euthanized beloved family pets with the kind of gentle professionalism that made the hardest decisions bearable. "Let's see what we're working with," she said, pulling on latex gloves as they approached the corral. The examination was thorough and methodical. Dr. Vasquez checked teeth, eyes and skin condition palpated for internal issues, and examined their hooves with practiced hands. Both donkeys submitted to her touch with surprising patience, as if they understood that her intentions were different from their previous experiences. "Well, the good news is that they're not as bad off as they could be," she said finally, stripping off her gloves. "Malnourished, obviously, and they've got some skin conditions that need treatment. The male has an abscess in his left front hoof that's been causing him pain. Both need worming, vaccinations, and hoof trimming." She pulled out a worn medical bag from her truck and began removing supplies, bottles of medicine, syringes and tools that looked more appropriate for a hospital than a ranch corral. The female might be pregnant, by the way. Hard to tell for certain in her condition, but there are signs. Clyde felt his stomach lurch. A pregnant donkey meant veterinary costs for the birth, more mouths to feed, complications he hadn't even considered. "How much is all this going to cost?" he asked. Dr. Vasquez looked at him with the kind of directness he'd come to expect from people who dealt with life and death decisions regularly. "For the immediate treatment, antibiotics, vitamins, hoof care, probably $300. If she is pregnant, we're looking at additional costs down the line. $300. Clyde thought about the mortgage payment due next month, about the dwindling balance in his checking account, about the hay he'd need to buy to feed these animals through the winter. But as he watched Dr. Vasquez prepare her treatments, watched Belle and Buck stand patiently for procedures that would help them heal, he found himself nodding. Do what they need. The treatment took 2 hours. Dr. Vasquez worked with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done these procedures thousands of times, explaining each step as she went. She treated the skin conditions with medicated shampoos, administered antibiotics and vitamins, and carefully trimmed and treated Buck's infected hoof. "This should start clearing up the skin problems within a week," she said, handing Clyde bottles of medication. "The antibiotics need to be given once a day for 10 days. The hoof treatment twice a day, until the abscess drains completely." She showed him how to administer the medicines, how to recognize signs of improvement or complications, how to care for animals he'd never expected to own. Her instructions were clear and patient, accompanied by written notes he could refer to later. "They're actually nice animals," she said as she packed up her equipment. "Donkeys are intelligent, more so than most people give them credit for. They bond strongly with their companions and can be very loyal once they trust you." As her truck disappeared down the driveway, Clyde looked at his new charges with something approaching affection. The immediate care had cost him money he couldn't afford, but both animals already seemed more alert, more hopeful. Belle had allowed him to touch her neck during the examination, and Buck had watched the entire process with interest rather than fear. That evening, as he gave them their first dose of medicine mixed with grain, Clyde found himself talking to them in the conversational tone he'd once used with Margaret. "Well, Belle, looks like you might be having a baby. That's something to look forward to, isn't it?" Belle's ears twitched forward at the sound of her name, and she nickered softly in response. "And Buck, that hoof's going to feel better in a few days. Dr. Vasquez knows what she's doing." As the sun set over the mountains, Clyde stood at the corral fence and watched his small herd, 43 cattle and 2 donkeys now, settle for the night. The financial reality of his decision would hit him again in the morning, when he had to figure out how to pay for medicine and extra feed on a budget that was already stretched to breaking. But for tonight, in the gathering darkness, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the particular satisfaction that comes from helping something vulnerable become strong again. The veterinary supplies sat in a neat arrangement on his kitchen counter. bottles and syringes that represented hope and healing, and the promise that tomorrow could be better than today. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it was a beginning. By the end of the first week, the transformation in Belle and Buck was remarkable. The antibiotics had cleared up the worst of their skin conditions, and regular feeding had begun to fill out their gaunt frames. More importantly, they'd begun to trust Clyde's presence, no longer retreating to the far end of the corral when he approached with feed or medicine. Belle was the first to warm up to him, allowing him to scratch behind her ears while she ate. Her coat, cleaned and treated, was revealing itself to be a lovely dappled grey, and her eyes had lost some of their wariness. Buck remained more cautious, but Clyde caught him watching with what looked like curiosity when Belle accepted human attention. The routine of caring for them had become part of Clyde's daily rhythm. Morning feeding, medicine administration, checking Buck's healing hoof, evening feeding. It added work to days that were already long, but it also added purpose. For the first time in years, Clyde found himself looking forward to specific moments in his day. The soft, nickering Belle made when she saw him coming. The way Buck positioned himself protectively, but no longer fearfully. Word of his purchase had spread through the community with the speed that news travels in rural areas. Jim Morrison stopped by on Thursday, ostensibly to check on a section of shared fence line, but clearly curious about the donkeys. "They're looking better," he admitted, leaning against the corral fence. "You always were good with animals, even back in high school." "I don't know anything about donkeys," Clyde replied honestly. "I'm learning as I go. That's all any of us can do." Jim watched Belle approach the fence, drawn by their voices. "Still can't figure out why you bought them, though." Clyde had been asking himself the same question. The rational explanations, they'd been cheap, he'd felt sorry for them, it was an impulse decision, all felt inadequate. "They needed someone," he said finally. "And I guess I needed something to need me." Jim nodded slowly. "Margaret always said you had too soft a heart for your own good." The comment stayed with Clyde after Jim left. Margaret had said that, usually when he'd brought home some stray animal or helped a neighbor who couldn't pay him back. She'd said it with affection, the way you point out a lovable flaw in someone you care about. But she'd also been right. His soft heart had led to a lot of decisions that made more emotional than financial sense. On Friday morning, Clyde made a discovery that stopped him cold. Attached to his front fence post, with what looked like a safety pin, was a piece of paper. Not expensive art paper, but the rough newsprint kind they gave children in school. Someone had drawn a picture in crayon. Two animals that were clearly meant to be donkeys, standing in front of a simple house. Above them, in careful block letters, was written, "Thank you for saving them." Clyde looked up and down the road, but saw no one. The drawing had to have been placed recently. Yesterday's wind would have blown loose paper away. Someone had made a special trip to his fence. Someone who knew about Belle and Buck and cared enough to create this small token of appreciation. He studied the drawing carefully. The artist was young, judging by the style and the careful way the letters had been formed. The donkeys were rendered with the kind of loving attention to detail that children bring to subjects that matter to them. Belle's grey coat carefully coloured in, Buck's protective posture captured despite the simple line work. Back in the house, Clyde found himself smoothing the drawing carefully and placing it on his refrigerator, held in place with a magnet advertising a feed store that had closed 5 years ago. It was the first decoration he'd added to his home since Margaret died, and seeing it there brought an unexpected warmth to the kitchen. That afternoon brought visitors of a different kind. A white sedan pulled into his driveway, and Clyde recognized the county extension agent, Mrs. Patterson, getting out of the driver's seat. She was the efficient woman in her 50s who knew every agricultural operation in the county and most of their problems. Afternoon. "Clyde, I heard you'd acquired some equines." "Donkeys," he corrected. "2 of them. Mind if I take a look? There's been some concern about proper care." And I like to check on animal welfare when situations change hands. The inspection was professional and thorough, but Clyde could tell Mrs. Patterson was surprised by what she found. Belle and Buck looked healthy, their coats glossy, their eyes bright. The corral was clean, water fresh, and hay abundant. They looked good, she admitted. Much better than their condition at impound. You've been giving them proper veterinary care. Dr. Vasquez was out earlier this week. They're on antibiotics and vitamin supplements. Mrs. Patterson made notes on her clipboard. Any particular plans for them? Breeding, work animals, companions? Clyde realized he'd never thought beyond the immediate need to help them recover. Companions, I guess. They seem happy enough together. Donkeys are social animals, Mrs. Patterson said. They do better in pairs or small groups than alone, and they're intelligent, more so than horses in some ways. They can live 25 or 30 years with proper care. 25 years. Clyde did quick math and realized that commitment could carry him well into his 80s. It was a sobering thought, but not an unwelcome one. At 63, the idea of having something to care for, some reason to get up every morning for the next quarter century, had unexpected appeal after Mrs. Patterson left. Clyde spent the evening watching Belle and Buck graze in the small pasture he'd opened for them. They stayed close together as always, but their movements were more relaxed now, less vigilant. Belle had discovered that the fence posts made excellent scratching surfaces, and Buck had claimed a spot near the water tank as his preferred resting place. As darkness fell, Clyde found himself thinking about the anonymous drawing, about a child who cared enough about two rescued donkeys to make art about them. In a week, when he'd received a past-due notice from the bank and learned that hay prices were going up again, that simple crayon drawing felt like a reminder that some things mattered more than money. The donkeys came to the fence when they saw him approaching with their evening hay, Belle nickering her greeting, Buck following closely behind. They no longer flinched when he reached through the rails to scratch their necks, and Belle had begun to actively seek out his touch. "You know what?" he said to them as they ate. "I think we're going to be just fine together." Belle looked up from her hay, ears forward, as if she'd been waiting for exactly that reassurance. Buck continued eating, but his ears swiveled toward Clyde's voice, listening to the tone, if not the words. Standing in his own pasture, watching two rescued animals enjoy their simple meal, Clyde felt something he'd almost forgotten: contentment. Not the desperate happiness of someone trying to convince himself everything was fine, but the quiet satisfaction that comes from doing right by something that depends on you. It was a small feeling, perhaps, but it was real. And it was his. The stars were beginning to appear in the clear desert sky. And somewhere down the road, a child was probably sleeping, dreaming of the donkeys they'd drawn with such care. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new financial worries, new decisions about how to manage a ranch that was barely surviving. But tonight, in this moment, all was well. 2 weeks after bringing Belle and Buck home, Clyde was cleaning out the storage closet in the spare bedroom when his hand closed around a familiar book. Margaret's garden journal, a cloth-bound notebook she'd kept for nearly 30 years, filled with her careful handwriting, documenting every success and failure of her beloved vegetable and flower gardens. He hadn't looked at it since the year after she died, when the sight of her handwriting had been too painful to bear. Now sitting on the edge of the bed, in the room that had once been her sewing space, he opened it with fingers that trembled slightly. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1983, just 2 years after they were married. Started tomato seeds today on the kitchen windowsill. Clyde thinks I'm crazy to start so early, but I have a good feeling about this season. The Farmer's Almanac says it'll be a good year for growing things. She'd been right about that year. Clyde remembered the abundance of that first garden, how proud Margaret had been of her tomatoes, how she'd canned enough salsa and sauce to last them through 2 winters. He turned pages slowly, reading her observations about soil conditions, weather patterns, which varieties of beans produced best in their high desert climate. But mixed in with the agricultural notes were glimpses of their life together. "Clyde built me a new trellis for the peas today. He pretended to grumble about it, but I caught him measuring twice to make sure it was perfect. Or found Clyde talking to the tomato plants this morning. He swears it helps them grow, and who am I to argue with results? The journal became a window into their shared years. Each entry, a small snapshot of a life built together. Margaret had noted the first frost dates, the last safe planting times, the peculiarities of their particular piece of land. But she'd also recorded birthday dinners prepared with vegetables from her own garden. The year they'd managed to grow pumpkins big enough for jack-o'-lanterns. The season when a family of rabbits had eaten half her lettuce crop, and she'd decided they needed it more than she did. Clyde's been quieter than usual lately, read one entry from 1995. I think he's worried about the drought, though he won't say so directly. Made his favorite zucchini bread today. Sometimes the best conversations happen over comfort food. Clyde remembered that drought, and he remembered the zucchini bread. Margaret had been right. He had been worried, and the simple act of her noticing, of responding with something made by her own hands from her own garden, had meant more than any conversation could have. As afternoon faded toward evening, he found himself walking out to where Belle and Buck were grazing in their small pasture, the journal tucked under his arm. They looked up at his approach, Belle abandoning her patch of grass to come to the fence, Buck following more slowly but with less reluctance than he'd shown even a week ago. "You know what, Belle?" Clyde said, scratching behind her ears. "I think you might like to hear about Margaret's garden." He settled himself on the wooden crate he'd been using as a makeshift seat and opened the journal to a random page. July 20th, 1987, he read aloud. "The corn is coming along beautifully this year. Clyde helped me put up the scarecrow yesterday, though between you and me, I think it looks more likely to scare the neighbors than any self-respecting crow." Belle's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice, and she moved closer to the fence. Buck, curious about his companion's interest, approached as well. There was something soothing about reading Margaret's words aloud, about sharing her gentle observations with creatures who listened without judgment. "The beans are producing so well I can barely keep up with the picking. Note to self, next year plant fewer bean plants or invite more neighbors to help with the harvest." Also, Clyde's been sneaking green beans straight from the plants when he thinks I'm not watching. I pretend not to notice because he gets such pleasure from thinking he's getting away with something. A laugh escaped Clyde at that memory. He had thought he was being sneaky, plucking the tender young beans directly from the vine while Margaret worked elsewhere in the garden. Discovering that she'd known all along, that she'd allowed him his small deception because it made him happy, was so perfectly Margaret that it brought tears to his eyes. The donkeys seemed to enjoy the sound of his voice, Belle actually resting her chin on the fence rail while he read. Buck maintained a respectful distance, but kept his attention focused on the human who'd begun sharing stories of seasons long past. Over the following days, the evening reading sessions became routine. Clyde would finish his ranch work, have his simple dinner, and then join Belle and Buck for what he'd begun thinking of as story time. Margaret's journal provided endless material, observations about weather patterns, notes about which crops grew well together, philosophical musings about the satisfaction of growing your own food. The townspeople, meanwhile, had begun to take notice of Clyde's unusual new hobby. Word traveled fast in small communities, and the image of the solitary rancher reading to his donkeys struck people as either endearingly eccentric or mildly concerning, depending on their perspective. Heard Clyde Renner's taken to reading bedtime stories to those donkeys he bought, Mrs. Henderson mentioned to the clerk at the feed store, her tone suggesting she wasn't sure whether to be amused or worried. "Maybe he's just lonely," replied Sarah Mitchell, who worked the counter and had known Clyde since high school. "Those animals probably appreciate the company." The speculation might have bothered Clyde if he'd known about it, but he was too absorbed in rediscovering Margaret's world through her careful notes. Her journal revealed a woman who found deep satisfaction in simple things: the first green shoots of spring, the weight of a perfectly ripe tomato, the knowledge that her canning shelves were full enough to see the family through winter. Reading her words aloud had an unexpected effect. The grief he'd carried for 7 years, the sharp edge of loss that had never quite healed, began to soften into something gentler. Margaret's voice, preserved in her careful handwriting, seemed to fill the evening air, her presence somehow more real when he shared her words with attentive listeners. It was during one of these reading sessions that Clyde noticed the change in Belle. Her sides, which had filled out nicely with regular feeding, seemed rounder than mere nutrition could account for. Her gait had developed a certain careful quality, and she'd begun seeking out the shadiest spots during the hottest parts of the day. "Belle, girl," he said, setting down the journal and studying her profile, "I think Dr. Vasquez might have been right about you." Belle looked at him with what seemed like calm acceptance, as if she'd been waiting for him to notice what she already knew. Buck moved closer to her, his protective instincts apparently extending to whatever was developing. The possibility of a foal, or more accurately, a donkey colt, brought new complications to consider. More veterinary expenses, additional feed costs, and the responsibility of caring for a newborn animal. But as Clyde watched Belle graze contentedly in the evening light, Buck standing guard beside her, he found himself looking forward to the prospect rather than dreading it. That night, he called Dr. Vasquez to schedule another visit. "I think Belle might be further along than we initially thought," he explained. "I'll be out tomorrow afternoon," she promised. "Pregnancy in donkeys lasts about a year, so if she's showing now, we'll want to make sure she's getting proper nutrition." After hanging up, Clyde returned to the journal, reading by lamplight about Margaret's notes on caring for pregnant animals. "Life has a way of surprising us," she'd written after their best milk cow delivered twin calves against all expectations. "Just when we think we have everything figured out, something new comes along to remind us that hope and possibility are always present, even in the most ordinary days." Outside, Belle and Buck had settled for the night, still close together, still watching over each other. Soon there might be 3 of them, a small family unit that had found refuge on a struggling ranch. It was more responsibility than Clyde had planned for, more expense than he could easily afford. But as he closed Margaret's journal and prepared for bed, he found himself grateful for the unexpected complications that had brought purpose back to his quiet days. Dr. Vasquez arrived the next afternoon with a portable ultrasound machine, a piece of equipment that looked impossibly sophisticated for a rural veterinary practice. Belle submitted to the examination with patient dignity, seeming to understand that the strange procedure was meant to help rather than harm. "Well, you're going to be a grandfather of sorts," Dr. Vasquez announced, pointing to the grainy image on the small screen. "She's about 6 months along, which means you can expect a foal sometime in early spring." Clyde studied the ultrasound image, trying to make sense of the abstract shapes that somehow represented new life. "Everything looked normal, as far as I can tell. Belle's in good health now, thanks to your care. We'll want to adjust her nutrition as she gets closer to term, but donkeys are generally easy birthers, much less complicated than horses." As Dr. Vasquez packed up her equipment, she seemed to be considering something. "You know, Clyde, you might be interested in something I heard about recently. There's a therapeutic ranch about 40 miles north of here. They use animals to help children with various challenges. Donkeys are particularly good for that kind of work. Therapeutic ranch, animal-assisted therapy. Children with autism, developmental delays, emotional trauma, they work with animals as part of their treatment. Donkeys are calm, patient, and they seem to have an instinct for reading people's emotions." The idea sounded intriguing but impractical. "I don't know anything about therapy or working with children." "You might know more than you think. I've seen you with animals your whole life, Clyde. You have the temperament for it." After she left, Clyde found himself thinking about her suggestion. Working with children, helping people heal, it sounded like something Margaret would have been interested in. The kind of purpose she'd always encouraged him to seek beyond just keeping the ranch running. 3 days later, an unexpected visitor provided more information about Dr. Vasquez's suggestion. A compact woman in her early 40s knocked on his door. Introducing herself as Maria Santos from the county's Social Services Department, Mr. Renner. I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit. Dr. Vasquez mentioned you might be interested in learning about therapeutic programs in the area. Maria had warm brown eyes and the kind of calm presence that suggested she dealt with difficult situations regularly and well. She accepted Clyde's offer of coffee and settled into Margaret's chair at the kitchen table as if she belonged there. I run a small therapeutic ranch called Healing Hearts, she explained, pulling a handmade brochure from her purse. We work with children who need extra support, kids with autism, anxiety disorders, some who've experienced trauma. Animals are incredibly effective therapists. The brochure was clearly assembled with more heart than budget. Printed on regular paper and folded by hand, it featured photographs of children interacting with horses, goats, and other animals. The kids in the pictures were smiling, engaged, their faces showing the kind of joy that comes from genuine connection. Dr. Vasquez told me about your donkeys, Maria continued. She thinks they might be perfect for our program. Donkeys are naturally gentle and intuitive. They seem to understand when someone needs comfort. Clyde studied the brochure while Maria talked. One photograph showed a young boy, maybe 8 years old, with his arms around a donkey's neck. The child's face was pressed against the animal's coat, and both boy and donkey looked completely peaceful. What would it involve? He asked. We'd start small. Maybe bring a few children here once a week. Let them interact with Belle and Buck in a controlled environment. I'd provide all the professional oversight. I'm a licensed therapist with specialized training in animal-assisted intervention. The prospect was both appealing and terrifying. Clyde hadn't worked with children since his brief stint as a substitute teacher decades ago, and that had been different. Classroom management, not therapy. But something about Maria's calm competence and the genuine joy in those brochure photographs made the idea seem possible. I'd need to think about it, he said finally. Of course. There's no pressure. But if you're interested, you could visit our current facility, see how the program works. After Maria left, Clyde found himself studying the brochure repeatedly. The mission statement, printed in simple font, read, Healing Hearts Ranch provides animal-assisted therapy to children and families dealing with emotional, physical, and developmental challenges. We believe that the healing power of human-animal bonds can create positive change in young lives. That evening, during his regular reading session with Belle and Buck, Clyde found his thoughts drifting from Margaret's garden notes to the possibility Maria had presented. Belle, her pregnancy now obvious in her changed profile, seemed particularly calm and attentive. Buck, as always, positioned himself protectively nearby, but his posture had relaxed considerably since those first fearful days. What do you think? Clyde asked them. You two up for helping some kids who need a friend? Belle's ears pricked forward at the question, and she moved closer to the fence. Buck followed, and for a moment all three of them stood in companionable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains. The following week, Clyde found himself driving north on a winding road toward Healing Hearts Ranch. The facility was smaller than he'd expected, a modest farmhouse, a few outbuildings and paddocks where horses and goats grazed peacefully. Children's laughter carried across the yard, mixed with the gentle sounds of animals going about their daily routines. Maria met him at the gate, wearing jeans and a simple shirt that suggested she did as much physical work as administrative. Welcome to our little operation, she said with genuine warmth. Ready for the tour? The tour revealed a program that was clearly successful despite operating on a shoestring budget. Maria introduced him to volunteers who worked with the animals, showed him the therapy areas where children and creatures interacted under careful supervision, and explained the various programs they offered. We serve about 30 children regularly, she explained, as they watched a teenage girl brush a patient horse. Some come because they're dealing with anxiety or depression. Others have autism or developmental delays. A few are working through trauma. The animals don't judge, they just accept and offer comfort. In one paddock, Clyde watched a young boy, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, leading a miniature horse around a small course. The child moved slowly, carefully, but with obvious pride in his accomplishment. A volunteer walked beside them, offering gentle encouragement. "That's Tommy," Maria said quietly. "He hasn't spoken since his father died 2 years ago, but he communicates beautifully with the animals." The scene was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Here was a child dealing with profound loss, finding a way to connect and heal through the simple act of caring for another living creature. "Your donkeys would fit perfectly here," Maria continued. "Donkeys are particularly good with children who have experienced trauma. They're protective but not overwhelming, calm but responsive." As they drove back toward the main building, Maria handed him another copy of the brochure, this one signed with a personal note. "Clyde, thank you for considering this opportunity. I believe Belle and Buck have found exactly the right person to help them fulfill their purpose." On the drive home, Clyde found himself thinking about purpose, his own, and that of his unexpected companions. For months, he'd been focused on simple survival, on keeping the ranch running and the bills paid. But Maria's program suggested something more, the possibility that his small act of compassion at the auction might ripple outward into something larger, something that could help children heal and grow. Belle and Buck were waiting at the fence when he arrived home, as if they'd been watching for his return. As he approached with their evening hay, Clyde made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. "Well, guys," he said, scratching Belle's neck, while Buck looked on approvingly, "I think we're about to start a new adventure." The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in late November. Maria had stopped by to discuss the logistics of bringing children to the ranch, and they were sitting at Clyde's kitchen table, sharing coffee and planning schedules, when her eye caught something on his refrigerator. Beside the child's crayon drawing of Belle and Buck was an older photograph, yellowed and curled at the edges, held in place by the same feed store magnet. It showed a younger Clyde, perhaps in his early 30s, surrounded by a group of children who were clearly special needs. His arm was around a boy with Down syndrome, and several other children clustered close to him, their faces bright with affection and trust. "Is that you?" Maria asked, studying the photograph more closely. Clyde glanced over, and his expression shifted subtly. Not exactly uncomfortable, but careful. "Long time ago," he said quietly. "You worked with special needs children." There was a long pause before Clyde answered. "For about 8 years. I was a special education teacher at the elementary school in Roswell." Maria set down her coffee cup, her professional instincts fully engaged. "Clyde, why didn't you mention this before? This changes everything. You have exactly the background we need." "Had," he corrected. "That was a long time ago, Maria. Different life." But Maria was studying the photograph with new understanding. The way the children gathered around him, the natural ease in his posture, the genuine joy in his younger face, these weren't the characteristics of someone who'd merely done a job. This was someone who'd found his calling. "What happened?" she asked gently. "Why did you leave teaching?" Clyde was quiet for a long time, staring out the window toward where Belle and Buck were settling for the night. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief carefully contained. "There was a boy named David," he said. "Severe autism, nonverbal but brilliant in his own way. He'd been in my classroom for 3 years, and we'd made incredible progress together. His parents trusted me completely. I was probably the only person outside his family who really understood how to communicate with him." Maria waited, recognizing the cadence of someone working through painful memories. David loved field trips. The sensory input usually overwhelmed other kids like him, but he thrived on new experiences. So when the district organized a trip to the Science Museum in Albuquerque, I advocated for him to go, even though the other teachers thought it was too risky. Clyde's hands tightened around his coffee mug. "The bus broke down on the way back. Nothing dramatic, just engine trouble on a busy highway. But David got agitated by the noise, the confusion, the change in routine. He slipped past the bus driver while I was helping another student, and he ran into traffic. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Maria had worked with enough families touched by tragedy to recognize the particular weight that comes with perceived responsibility for the unthinkable. "It wasn't your fault," she said softly. His parents didn't see it that way. Neither did the school district. Neither did I, for a long time. Clyde looked directly at her for the first time since beginning the story. "I resigned at the end of that school year. Came back to the ranch and never worked with children again." How long ago was this? 28 years last spring. Maria absorbed this information, understanding now why Clyde had seemed both naturally gifted with Belle and Buck, and reluctant to commit to working with children again. The photograph on his refrigerator wasn't just a memento, it was evidence of a calling he'd abandoned after one devastating day. "You know that what happened to David wasn't your fault, don't you?" She said. "Accidents happen, Clyde. Terrible, heartbreaking accidents that no amount of care or preparation can prevent. I know that in my head. Took me about 15 years to know it in my heart. But knowing it and trusting myself with other people's children again, those are different things." They sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Outside, a coyote called from the hills, and Belle answered with a soft bray that somehow seemed to acknowledge the conversation taking place. "Can I ask you something?" Maria said finally. "Why did you keep the photograph?" Clyde looked toward the refrigerator, his expression softening slightly. "Margaret put it there years ago. She said I shouldn't hide from the good I'd done just because of one terrible day. After she died, I couldn't bear to take it down. It felt like losing another piece of her. She was right, you know, about not hiding from the good." Before Clyde could respond, a sound from outside caught their attention. Belle calling out in distress, followed by Buck's agitated braying. Both humans were on their feet immediately, grabbing flashlights and rushing toward the corral. Belle was lying on her side in the dirt, clearly in labor. Buck paced nervously nearby, his protective instincts engaged, but his ability to help limited. In the beam of Clyde's flashlight, they could see that the birth was already well underway. "Should I call Dr. Vasquez?" Maria asked. "No time," Clyde replied, his voice steady and calm. "This is happening now." What followed was 2 hours of careful attendance as Belle worked to bring her foal into the world. Clyde moved with quiet competence, offering comfort and assistance when needed, staying back when Belle's instincts were sufficient. Maria watched in amazement as he seemed to intuitively understand what the laboring donkey needed. A gentle touch here, encouraging words there, simple presence throughout. When the foal finally emerged, a perfect miniature of his mother, complete with her dappled grey coat, Belle immediately began the ancient ritual of cleaning and bonding. The baby, no larger than a medium-sized dog, struggled to his feet within minutes, already seeking his first meal. "He's beautiful," Maria whispered, not wanting to disturb the new family's first moments together. Buck had calmed considerably once the foal was safely delivered, and now he stood guard over both mother and baby with obvious pride. The little family group, illuminated by a flashlight in the New Mexico night, presented a picture of such complete contentment that both humans found themselves smiling despite their exhaustion. "Look at that," Clyde said softly. Buck's already claimed him as his own. It was true. The older male donkey had positioned himself protectively over the foal, gently nuzzling the baby and offering comfort to Belle. The bond between all three animals was immediate and profound. As they walked back to the house to call Dr. Vasquez for a post-birth check, Maria found herself thinking about the evening's revelations. The photograph on the refrigerator, the tragic story of David, and now this new life, it all seemed connected somehow, and part of a larger story about second chances and the healing power of caring for vulnerable creatures. "Clyde," she said as they reached the porch, "I want you to think about something. That little foal is going to grow up knowing nothing but kindness and protection. He'll never know that his mother was once neglected and afraid because you changed her story." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes we get second chances to do the thing we were meant to do, not to undo the past, but to honor it by doing better in the future." Clyde looked back toward the corral, where 3 donkeys were beginning their new life together as a family. In the distance, the lights of town glowed softly, and somewhere among those lights were children who needed the kind of gentle, patient care that came naturally to him. "You really think Belle and Buck could help kids heal?" he asked. "I think you and Belle and Buck together could work miracles," Maria replied. "The question is whether you're ready to trust yourself with that kind of responsibility again." As they stood on the porch, watching over their small miracle, Clyde felt something shift inside him, not the erasure of old grief, but the possibility of new purpose rising alongside it. Margaret had been right to keep that photograph on the refrigerator. Some gifts were too valuable to abandon, even when they came wrapped in painful memories. The foal's first night in the world was peaceful, marked by the patient vigilance of his adoptive father and the gentle care of his mother. And in the house nearby, 2 humans planned for a future that might give meaning to both past sorrows and present hopes. The weeks following the foal's birth passed in a blur of preparation and nervous anticipation. Dr. Vasquez pronounced all 3 donkeys healthy, and the baby, whom Clyde had named Hope, despite Maria's gentle suggestion that the children should have naming rights, thrived under the protective care of both parents. Buck had surprised everyone by becoming an exemplary adoptive father. He stayed close to Belle and the foal, alert to any potential danger, and seemed to understand that his role now extended beyond mere companionship to active protection. The sight of the 3 donkeys together, Belle grazing peacefully while Buck watched over the nursing foal, had become Clyde's favorite part of each day. Maria visited twice a week now, ostensibly to check on the animal's progress, but really to help Clyde prepare emotionally for working with children again. She brought training materials, articles about animal-assisted therapy, and most importantly, patience with his questions and doubts. "What if I freeze up?" he asked during one of their sessions. They were sitting in the barn, watching the donkeys while discussing therapy protocols. "What if seeing those kids brings back everything about David? Then we'll deal with it," Maria replied calmly. "Clyde, you're not the same person who lost David. You've lived 28 years since then, learned things, grown in ways you probably don't even recognize. And the children we'll be working with aren't David. They're individuals with their own needs and their own stories." She pulled out a folder thick with documentation. "I've been doing this work for 12 years. I've seen volunteers freeze up, break down, discover they weren't cut out for it, and recover beautifully to become our best therapists. The key is honest communication and gradual exposure. The gradual exposure began with Maria, bringing photographs and case studies of the children who might benefit from working with the donkeys. There was Tommy, the non-verbal boy Clyde had seen at Healing Hearts, who had shown remarkable progress with the miniature horse. Sarah, a 10-year-old with severe anxiety, who found peace in grooming and caring for gentle animals. Marcus, a teenager with autism who had difficulty with social interactions, but displayed natural empathy with creatures who couldn't judge or misunderstand him. "Each child is different," Maria explained, spreading the files across Clyde's kitchen table. "Some will want to touch and interact immediately. Others might sit quietly and just observe for weeks before they're ready for contact. Your job isn't to push or guide or teach in any traditional sense. Your job is to create a safe space where healing can happen naturally." The concept was both liberating and terrifying. Clyde's teaching experience had been built around lesson plans, measurable objectives, structured progress. This was something entirely different, creating conditions for organic growth rather than directing specific outcomes. "What about Hope?" he asked, watching the foal explore the world with the fearless curiosity of the very young. "Is he too little to be part of this?" Actually, young animals can be especially therapeutic. Children often see themselves reflected in babies, vulnerable but growing stronger, dependent but learning independence. Hope's presence might be exactly what some of our kids need to see. As February melted into March, the practical preparations began in earnest. Clyde reinforced fence lines, built a small shelter where children could sit comfortably while interacting with the donkeys, and created pathways that would be safe for kids with mobility challenges. Maria helped him understand the legal requirements, insurance, background checks, safety protocols that had to be followed to the letter. The background check process brought unexpected anxiety. Clyde found himself wondering if the circumstances of David's death would disqualify him, if the school district's files would contain damaging information, if his 28-year absence from education would count against him. But when the clearance came through without complications, Maria simply smiled and said, "Sometimes the past stays in the past where it belongs." The first test visit was scheduled for a Saturday in mid-March. Maria would bring 3 children, Tommy, Sarah, and a new boy named Alex, who had been recently referred after his parents' divorce left him struggling with anger and sadness. They would spend 2 hours at the ranch, with no specific agenda beyond allowing natural interactions to develop. Clyde spent the morning before the visit obsessively preparing. He cleaned the barn, organized his tools, checked and rechecked the safety features he'd installed. Belle, Buck, and Hope seemed to sense his nervous energy, staying close to the fence and watching his preparations with alert attention. "You're more ready than you think," Maria said when she arrived an hour early to help with final preparations. She watched him adjust the gate latch for the 3rd time and smiled. "The children aren't coming here to judge your facilities or evaluate your teaching skills. They're coming to meet 3 donkeys who have learned to trust again after difficult beginnings." Just like them, when the small van pulled into his driveway, Clyde felt his heart rate accelerate in a way that reminded him of his first day in the classroom 3 decades ago. Through the windows, he could see 3 young faces peering out with mixtures of curiosity and apprehension. Tommy was the first to emerge, a slight 8-year-old with dark hair and serious eyes. He moved slowly, taking in the ranch surroundings with careful attention to detail. Sarah followed, a pretty girl whose hands fluttered nervously at her sides, her gaze darting between the adults and the animals. Alex came last, a stocky 12-year-old whose defensive posture and crossed arms announced his skepticism about the entire enterprise. "Everybody, this is Mr. Clyde," Maria said with warm formality. "He's the one who takes care of Belle, Buck, and Hope." The children nodded politely but said nothing. Clyde found himself searching for the right words, the perfect opening that would put them at ease and establish connection. But before he could speak, Belle solved the problem by approaching the fence and offering her soft greeting nicker. Tommy's face transformed immediately. Without speaking, he walked directly to the fence and extended his hand, palm flat, the way someone had obviously taught him to greet unfamiliar animals. Belle sniffed his hand, then gently nuzzled his palm, and Tommy's whole body relaxed in a way that spoke of recognition, one cautious soul meeting another. "She likes you," Clyde said quietly, moving to stand beside the boy. Tommy looked up at him and smiled, the first genuine expression Clyde had seen from him. Then he turned back to Belle and began what could only be described as a conversation. Soft sounds that weren't quite words, gentle touches, and a quality of attention that was completely focused and peaceful. Sarah hung back initially. But when Hope wandered over to investigate the newcomers, her reserve crumbled. "Oh," she breathed, "he's so little." The foal, now 6 weeks old and boldly curious about everything, approached the fence where Sarah stood and looked up at her with dark, intelligent eyes. When she tentatively reached out to touch his soft nose, Hope leaned into the contact with the trust that comes naturally to creatures who have known only kindness. Alex remained stubbornly unimpressed, arms crossed, maintaining careful distance from both animals and humans. But Clyde noticed that his eyes followed Buck's movements, and when the older donkey positioned himself protectively between the children and the rest of the pasture, something in Alex's expression shifted slightly. "Buck's the dad," Clyde explained, addressing the comment to the group, but watching Alex particularly. "Not the biological father, but he's taken responsibility for protecting Belle and Hope. Sometimes that's more important than biology." Alex's arms uncrossed slightly at this observation, and when Buck approached the fence near where he stood, The boy didn't back away. The 2 hours passed more quickly than anyone expected. No dramatic breakthroughs occurred, no miraculous healings, but something subtler and perhaps more important happened. 3 children, who had come carrying various forms of emotional pain, found themselves, for a brief time, simply present in the moment with creatures who asked nothing of them beyond acceptance. Tommy spent the entire visit with Belle, their silent communication growing more elaborate as time passed. Sarah gradually gained confidence with Hope, eventually laughing out loud when the foal tried to nibble her shoelaces. Alex never actively engaged with Buck, but he stopped maintaining his defensive posture and began asking practical questions about donkey care and behavior. As the children prepared to leave, Maria handed Clyde a simple wooden sign she'd had made, "Welcome to Belle Vista Therapy Ranch, a place for healing hearts." The lettering was professional but warm, and a small image of donkeys was painted in the corner. "This is official now," she said as they mounted the sign near the gate. "You're not just Clyde Renner with 3 donkeys anymore. You're part of something bigger." That evening, as Clyde sat with his animals during their usual story time, he found himself reading from Margaret's journal, but thinking about the day's events. Tommy's transformation from wariness to trust, Sarah's delighted laughter, Alex's grudging interest, all of it felt familiar in the best possible way. "You know what, Margaret?" he said aloud, looking up at the stars beginning to appear in the clear desert sky. "I think we might be onto something here." Belle and Buck stood quietly at the fence, Hope nestled between them, and all 3 animals seemed to be listening to more than just his voice. They were hearing the promise of purpose, the possibility that their own journey from abandonment to security might become a bridge for other broken spirits seeking healing. The sign by the gate caught the last light of sunset, its message clear and welcoming. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new children, new opportunities to discover whether love and patience really could work the quiet miracles that Maria believed in. But tonight, in the peaceful darkness of the ranch, everything felt possible. The first official therapy session was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in early April. Maria arrived with just 1 child this time, Tommy, the non-verbal boy who had formed such an immediate connection with Belle during the test visit. His mother, Linda, came along to observe, her face showing the cautious hope of a parent who had tried many interventions with limited success. "Tommy's been talking about Belle all week," Linda explained to Clyde as they watched her son immediately gravitate toward the fence where the donkeys waited. "He doesn't speak, but he hums the tune to 'Mary Had a Little Lamb' whenever he sees pictures of donkeys now." Clyde watched Tommy approach Belle with the same careful confidence he'd shown before. The boy moved slowly, respectfully, extending his hand for Belle's inspection before attempting any contact. Belle, as if she remembered their previous meeting, came directly to him with her soft, welcoming nicker. "That's remarkable," Maria murmured. "She's responding to him differently than to the other children. More directly, more immediately." What happened next surprised everyone, including Clyde. Tommy began humming, and Belle's ears pricked forward with obvious interest. The melody was simple, repetitive, but there was something about the boy's humming that seemed to captivate the donkey completely. She moved closer to the fence, lowering her head so that Tommy could scratch behind her ears while he hummed. "I've never seen him sustain attention like this with anything," Linda whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Clyde found himself remembering something from his teaching days, the power of music to reach children who seemed unreachable through traditional communication. On impulse, he walked to his truck and retrieved something from the glove compartment, an old harmonica he'd carried for years but rarely played. The harmonica was a simple instrument, worn smooth by handling, with small dents that gave it character. Clyde's father had given it to him when he was 12, and he'd played it occasionally throughout his life. Campfire songs, simple melodies that helped him think or unwind after difficult days. "Tommy," he said quietly, approaching the boy and the donkey, "would you like to try making music together?" Tommy looked at the harmonica with immediate interest. When Clyde played a few notes of "Mary Had a Little Lamb," The boy's face lit up with recognition and delight. Belle's reaction was even more pronounced. She lifted her head and actually seemed to move in rhythm with the simple melody. What followed was unlike anything Clyde had experienced in his teaching career. Tommy took the harmonica and, after a few experimental breaths, began playing the same tune. His technique was inexpert but heartfelt, and Belle responded by moving even closer, resting her chin on the fence rail near the boy's shoulder. Buck, drawn by the unusual sounds, approached with Hope close behind. Soon, all 3 donkeys were gathered near Tommy, their attention focused not just on the music, but on the boy creating it. Hopi, with the fearlessness of youth, stretched his small neck through the fence rails to investigate the harmonica more closely. "This is extraordinary," Maria said softly. "I've never seen animals respond to music therapy quite like this." Tommy played the simple tune repeatedly, each repetition becoming more confident and clear. Between songs, he hummed to the donkeys, and they responded with soft, nickering sounds that seemed almost conversational. Belle particularly seemed to understand that this boy was special, requiring a different kind of attention and patience than other children. After about 30 minutes, something magical happened. Tommy, still humming, reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, a drawing he'd made of Belle. It was remarkably detailed for a child's artwork, capturing not just Belle's physical appearance, but something essential about her gentle nature. He held the drawing up for Belle to see, and she actually leaned forward to sniff the paper, as if she understood that this was meant for her. Then Tommy looked directly at Clyde, something his mother later said was rare for him, and smiled. "That's beautiful, Tommy," Clyde said, accepting the drawing. "Belle looks very happy in your picture." Tommy nodded emphatically and returned to his harmonica, playing "Mary Had a Little Lamb" one more time. This repetition was the clearest yet, and when he finished, all 3 donkeys seemed to nod their approval, as if applauding his performance. As the session ended, Linda approached Clyde with tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what you did," she said, "but Tommy hummed all the way home last week, and he's been drawing pictures of Belle every day since. His teacher says he's been more engaged at school, more willing to participate in group activities." "It wasn't me," Clyde replied, watching Tommy reluctantly say goodbye to Belle. "It was her." Animals have a way of seeing straight to what matters most in a person. As Tommy's family drove away, the boy's face pressed to the car window, waving goodbye to the donkeys. Maria turned to Clyde with something approaching awe in her expression. "Do you realize what just happened? You didn't just facilitate a therapy session, you created a language." Music became the bridge between a non-verbal child and his healing companions. Clyde looked down at the harmonica in his hands, then at the drawing Tommy had made of Belle. Such simple tools, an old instrument, a child's artwork. 3 rescued donkeys, but together they'd created something that felt miraculous. "You know what the best part is?" he said to Maria. "I remember now why I became a teacher in the first place. It was never about lesson plans or curriculum standards. It was about moments like this, when everything clicks and you can see a child's world expand just a little bit." Belle, Buck, and Hope had returned to their grazing, but Belle kept looking toward the gate where Tommy had stood. She seemed to understand that something important had happened, that this was just the beginning of a new kind of purpose for all of them. By early summer, Belle Vista Therapy Ranch was serving 8 children regularly, and the transformation in all involved was undeniable. Tommy had progressed from humming to attempting simple words, his first being Belle, spoken so clearly that his mother cried with joy. Sarah had overcome much of her anxiety and now helped Clyde with basic donkey care, her confidence growing with each successful task. Alex, the angry boy from the divorce, had become Hope's primary caregiver during visits, channeling his protective instincts into something positive. The collection of thank you cards and drawings on Clyde's refrigerator had grown to cover most of the surface. Hand-drawn pictures of donkeys, crayon portraits of Clyde with various children, and carefully lettered notes of appreciation from parents created a colorful tapestry of gratitude. "Dear Mr. Clyde," read one card from a girl named Emma who struggled with selective mutism. Thank you for letting me brush Belle's mane. She's very pretty and very nice. My mom says I talk more now because Belle taught me that quiet is okay, but words are good too. Another, from Marcus, the teenager with autism, was more elaborate. The donkeys understand schedules and routines like I do. Buck always stands in the same place at feeding time. Belle always checks on Hope 3 times before she eats. They have patterns that make sense. Being with them makes the world feel less chaotic. Word of the program's success had spread through the community in ways that surprised Clyde. Dr. Vasquez mentioned it to other ranchers. Maria shared stories at professional conferences. Parents talked to other parents, and teachers began referring students who might benefit from animal-assisted therapy. The first official recognition came from the county commissioners, who visited on a Tuesday afternoon to see the program in action. Commissioner Martinez, a grandfather himself, watched Tommy play harmonica for the donkeys and shook his head in amazement. "I've seen a lot of programs come and go," he told Clyde afterward, "but I've never seen anything that works quite like this." The county would like to provide a small grant to help with feed costs and equipment. The grant wasn't large, but it represented something more important than money: community acknowledgement that Belle Vista Therapy Ranch was providing a valuable service. Clyde, who had spent years feeling invisible and isolated, suddenly found himself at the center of something that mattered to people. The local newspaper ran a feature story with photographs of children working with the donkeys. The headline read, "Rescued Animals Rescue Hearts," and the article detailed the program's growth from Clyde's impulsive auction purchase to a therapeutic resource that was changing young lives. "I never intended for any of this," Clyde told the reporter. "But sometimes the best things happen when you're not planning them." Hope's integration into the therapy program marked another milestone. At 4 months old, the young donkey had grown confident and curious, unafraid of children and eager for attention. His first formal session was with a 6-year-old girl named Lily, who'd been traumatized by a car accident that killed her grandfather. Lily had been silent and withdrawn since the accident, unable to process her grief or reconnect with the world around her. But when Hope approached her with his characteristic boldness, something shifted. The foal, perhaps sensing her vulnerability, became gentler than usual, allowing her to sit beside him while he rested in the shade. "He's little like me," Lily whispered to Clyde, her first words in weeks. "But he's not scared." "Hope's learned that the world can be safe," Clyde replied carefully. "His Mama Belle and his Papa Buck have shown him that there are people who will protect him and love him." Lily considered this, her small hand resting on Hope's neck. "Maybe I can learn that too." That evening, after Lily's session, Clyde found himself standing at the fence where this all began, where he'd first brought Belle and Buck on that uncertain night 8 months ago. The transformation was remarkable. 3 animals who had known neglect and abandonment were now the center of a thriving program that brought healing to children throughout the region. Maria joined him at the fence, carrying a folder thick with new referrals and expansion possibilities. "The school district wants to formalize a partnership," she announced. "Regular sessions for special education students, training for teachers interested in animal-assisted learning, maybe even a summer camp program." Clyde looked at the folder, then at his 3 donkeys grazing peacefully in the evening light. 8 months ago, I thought my life was winding down. I was just trying to keep the ranch from falling apart and maybe find a little peace in my remaining years. And now I feel like I'm just getting started." He accepted the folder and flipped through the first few pages. Detailed proposals, budget projections, letters of support from parents and professionals. "These kids have given me something I didn't even know I was missing." "What's that?" "A reason to get up in the morning that's bigger than just surviving." As if summoned by their conversation, all 3 donkeys approached the fence where Clyde and Maria stood. Belle came first, as always, seeking her evening head scratch. Buck followed, his protective presence now as natural as breathing. Hope brought up the rear, bouncing with the irrepressible energy of youth. "You know what I think?" Maria said, watching the animals interact with their human friends. I think you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do. The thank you cards on Clyde's refrigerator would continue to multiply, each one representing a child whose life had been touched by the simple act of caring for gentle creatures. But more than that, they represented the unexpected ways that love multiplies when it's given freely. How rescuing 3 abandoned animals could lead to healing dozens of wounded spirits. How one man's compassion could ripple outward into something that changed an entire community. As the stars appeared in the desert sky, Clyde stood with his animals and his colleague, planning for a future that felt rich with possibility. The scared, isolated rancher who had bid $25 on unwanted donkeys no longer existed. In his place stood someone who had rediscovered his purpose and his power to make the world a little bit better. One child and one donkey at a time. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning, Clyde stood beside the new sign that marked the entrance to his property. The original "Welcome to Bella Vista Therapy Ranch" had been replaced with something more substantial, a carved wooden sign mounted on stone pillars, with professional lettering and a detailed image of 3 donkeys painted by a local artist. Below the main text, smaller words read, "A place where healing hearts find hope." The transformation of the ranch was remarkable. What had once been a struggling cattle operation clinging to survival was now a thriving therapeutic center that served 42 children from 3 counties. The old barn had been renovated with meeting spaces and equipment storage. New fencing created safe interaction areas designed specifically for children with various mobility and sensory needs. A small building housed Maria's office and a resource library for parents and volunteers. But the most dramatic change wasn't in the facilities. It was in the man who had created them. Clyde Renner, who had spent years watching his world shrink to the boundaries of survival, now found himself at the center of an expanding community of children, parents, volunteers, and professionals who had become like family. The morning routine had evolved considerably from those early days. Belle, now a confident mother and senior therapy animal, had learned to recognize the sounds of arriving vehicles and would position herself near the gate to greet incoming children. Buck remained the protective patriarch, his calm presence offering security to anxious kids and nervous parents alike. Hope, nearly 7 months old and full of personality, had become the star of the program, his boundless energy and fearless affection working magic with children who had forgotten how to trust. Dr. Vasquez arrived for her monthly wellness check just as Clyde finished the morning feeding. She'd become more than a veterinarian. She was part of the extended Bella Vista family, often bringing her own grandchildren to volunteer and witness the therapeutic magic that happened here. "Look at this place," she said, surveying the activity as children began arriving for Saturday morning sessions. "When you called me about those 2 half-dead donkeys, I never imagined it would lead to this." Neither had Clyde. The boy who'd struggled with selective mutism was now helping younger children learn to communicate with the animals. The girl who'd been traumatized by her grandfather's death had become Hope's primary trainer, teaching him simple tricks that delighted other children. The angry teenager from the divorce had surprised everyone by expressing interest in studying veterinary medicine. "Tommy's mother called yesterday," Maria reported, joining them near the fence. "He's been selected for the regional music competition. He's going to play 'Mary Had a Little Lamb' on the harmonica. Belle's song, he calls it. The harmonica had become one of Clyde's most treasured possessions. Tommy still used it during his sessions, but other children had begun bringing their own instruments, small drums, simple flutes, even a child-sized guitar. Music had become an integral part of the program, another language for communication between species. The financial transformation was equally remarkable. The county grant had been followed by a state allocation for rural therapeutic programs. Private donations from grateful families had funded facility improvements. The school district partnership provided steady income that more than covered expenses. For the first time in years, Clyde wasn't worried about making the mortgage payment or buying hay for his animals, but the most meaningful change was personal. Clyde had rebuilt connections with neighbors who'd watched his transformation with amazement and respect. Jim Morrison now volunteered regularly, using his carpentry skills to build therapy equipment and maintain facilities. The town pastor had organized fundraising drives. Even the bank manager who'd sent those threatening notices had visited to see the program and ended up sponsoring a scholarship fund for children whose families couldn't afford sessions. Margaret's garden journal still held a place of honor on Clyde's nightstand, but he'd stopped reading it every evening. Instead, he found himself writing his own journal, documenting the progress of various children, noting which approaches worked best with different personalities, planning expansions and improvements. His grief for Margaret hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed from paralyzing loss to grateful memory. She'd helped shape the man who was capable of creating this healing space. The afternoon brought a special ceremony. The county commissioners had decided to officially recognize Belle Vista Therapy Ranch as a model program, worthy of replication throughout the state. Local families, professionals, and children who'd participated in the program gathered to celebrate. As the ceremony began, Clyde found himself thinking about that auction 8 months ago. He'd bid $25 on 2 broken animals because something inside him recognized their need and his own capacity to meet it. Now those same animals were surrounded by dozens of people whose lives they'd touched, whose healing they'd facilitated, whose hope they'd restored. Commissioner Martinez presented a plaque recognizing the ranch's contribution to the community. But the real recognition came from the children themselves. One by one, they shared stories of how Belle, Buck, and Hope had helped them find courage, confidence, and connection. "Belle taught me that being quiet is okay, but having friends is better," said Emma, the girl with selective mutism who now spoke confidently to groups. "Buck showed me that protecting people doesn't mean being angry all the time," offered Alex, whose defensive anger had transformed into purposeful advocacy for other children. "Hope proves that little things can be brave too," added Lily, whose trauma from her grandfather's death had healed into a mature understanding of loss and resilience. As the sun set over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sky in familiar shades of copper and gold, Clyde stood with his 3 donkeys and surveyed the community they'd helped create. Children and parents lingered after the ceremony, reluctant to leave the peace and joy that seemed to emanate from this small corner of New Mexico high desert. Belle approached the fence where Clyde stood, offering her familiar soft nicker. Buck joined her, Hope bouncing between them with typical enthusiasm. The photograph that had started everything, the crayon drawing from that first anonymous child, was now framed in Clyde's living room, surrounded by dozens of similar tributes from grateful families. "Well, guys," Clyde said to his animals, scratching behind Belle's ears the way she loved, "I guess we found our purpose after all." The donkeys seemed to agree, content in the knowledge that they'd come home in the most complete sense possible. Not just to a place where they were safe and cared for, but to a place where their presence created safety and care for others. They'd journeyed from abandonment to belonging, from being unwanted to being essential, from surviving to thriving. In the distance, the lights of town began to twinkle, and among those lights were homes where children were sleeping better because they'd found peace with gentle animals, where parents were hoping again because they'd witnessed small miracles, where a community had been reminded that sometimes salvation comes in the form of the most unexpected gifts. The new sign caught the last light of evening, its message clear and welcoming to all who passed by. Belle Vista Therapy Ranch, a place where healing hearts find hope. But Clyde knew the real sign was less visible and more powerful. The transformation of 3 broken souls into healers. The proof that love given freely multiplies beyond imagination. The demonstration that second chances can become first beginnings. As the stars appeared in the clear desert sky, Clyde Renner walked toward his house, followed by 3 donkeys who had taught him that sometimes the most important decision you can make is to say, simply and completely, I'll give you a home.